What's up, Team Starlight? We are here today with none other than the Edison format frog tier list. And today we have a special guest with us, none other than the Frog King himself, the Frog Cooker, the Frog Scientist, whatever you want to call yourself, Roghnach. Welcome to the Team Starlight show.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, and with us, obviously, hi, I'm Macro, aka Marcos, whatever you want to call me, as long as it starts with an M and ends with an O. Today with us, we have Declan, one of our Team Starlight members.
What's up, guys?
And then we also have George, other Team Starlight member.
Hello.
And in the background, Albert is gonna just like be vibing, maybe come in and say a joke.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm known for. Hey, everyone.
But I am not a frog expert. My two teammates, Declan and George, who are frog experts as well with Roghnach. So they're gonna be the ones giving most of the opinions. I'm just here to help moderate it, so we're not here for 6 hours. So we have made a beautiful slideshow for us today, and with some considerations, right? These are some of the things that we're going to look at, some of the pros and cons when it comes to these types of builds. We're looking for resilience to side deck hate, presence of extenders, overall card quality, whether or not it generates card advantage, the deck strategy, the sack factor, open board pressure. These are some points that Roghnach has actually introduced to us as things we should consider, and we have considered it pretty heavily.
A frog deck doesn't need to have all these things to necessarily be good, but they're just some things that I take into consideration when building a deck and trying to evaluate how good it is.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely think that's like the main thing about like the frogs is that like they're all different. They all have their different qualities to them. And this is actually just going to help us showcase to those of you out there that want to try frogs, like what pros and cons you like, what things that you fit your playstyle.
Also, one more thing is with regards to this tier list, we'll be dropping things, in S, A, B, C. We're trying to evaluate frogs against other frog decks. We're not placing these decks against the Edison meta, so everything is within the context of frogs. Why should I play this frog deck over another frog deck?
Yep. So like a C tier frog deck could still be a B tier deck in the meta. Because if we're being honest, frog decks for the most part are all pretty good. And yeah, C doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad deck by any means.
Beautiful. Let's get this going. First thing on our list, classic frog monarchs.
This is the
Yep.
deck that started it all, baby. It's you got your triple Soul Exchange, you got triple Ryza, you got Thestalos, Lad. This deck is particular deck list, I believe, is Fraser Smith. Some new versions of the deck are now playing Arm Sea Hunter. This is just what you think of when you think of classic Frog Monarchs.
Yep. And it's an old build too. So there's like obviously some really good strengths. I think this one's probably the easiest to play just because it's normal summon Monarch or Soul Exchange, tribute for a Monarch. And it's super consistent. I think most people agree like playing against just regular Frog Monarchs game one is like pretty brutal for the opponent. But I think some of the flaws in this build, because it is like a little bit older, is you only really do one thing per turn. So it's a little bit slower than how decks are played now. And to me, you see like one Mask of Restrict and it's over, so it's not as resilient against a side deck as decks that will have like multiple engines, I think.
Yeah, it does become quite predictable as well, and always had the classic problem of what do you do against an open board. So Thestalos in that case helps a little bit. Sea Hunter, not really that much against an open board. Light and Darkness Dragon can a bit, but that again depends on your opponent and the matchup and all that kind of stuff. So I guess you could say that Light and Darkness Dragon is kind of like an unfair thing that the deck can do. But again, it kind of have to see your cards in the right order. That's kind of the problem with Frognarchs, is that like you see a bunch of frogs, or you see a bunch of stealing spells, or you see a bunch of monarchs or something, and they don't all fit together in the right way. That was always kind of one of the problems you could have, which is something that happens to a lot of frog decks. So again, like you're saying, it's a good deck for people to start with as well. And it's definitely something that could top at any moment, really. It's just something that people tend to move on from, I guess.
Yeah, I think that this deck is a very much always a threat to top events, but I think where it can struggle is when you get to that top echelon or in top cut and your deck strategy is so linear and you're playing against the best of players. This one might have a trouble converting into an actual win. So yeah, with that in mind, where do you guys think this should go in the tier list?
I still think this deck, despite it being I mean, realistically, the oldest build on the list, I think it's still really good. And just being able to have 7 Monarchs and Lad, which is my favorite card, I would put it in like A, I think, or like the top of B, but probably A. Um, it's like linear strategy, but Monarchs are just really good, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think if it's either like top of B or bottom of A. It's just really consistent at what it does. Can sometimes get countered, but it's a solid deck.
Yeah, I'm definitely with that as well. I'm not sure if we have that version with the water art owie in it, which is very
I
similar,
love
which
that
has the
card.
stages. Yeah, because that's also done very well, like last year in Italy and elsewhere, like online as well. So yeah, probably the same, like bottom of A at a minimum, I would say, or like maybe
Yeah.
yeah, top of B at a minimum, whatever you want to call it. But
Okay, so it sounded like A. It sounds like A minus, but like definitely the gatekeeper of A's. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
yeah,
B makes me
like
think it's like in the middle, which it definitely isn't, right?
Yeah, let's go A.
a little bit better
Yeah.
than that.
And I wanted to point out one thing that I feel like this deck has over like all these. It has like probably the best game one of all the Monarchs, because like, yeah, it
That's
loses to
fair.
a lot of side deck stuff, but like, its game one is just like so annoying. Like, okay, next up on the chopping block, we got the big behemoth, the actual boss monster, the one of the big 3 in Edison format, Hero Frogs.
Yep. We can just get this one out of the way. It's really good. Obviously, Ab Zero is insane extender. The fact that it can get buffed up to like 4K and you just hit people for half their life in one turn is honestly insane. I think just all the cards that you play are really good. Stratos, playing all the hero package cards, lets you really run like everything that's good, I think. And what I like is because it has so many engines, it doesn't lose to a single card. So like Frog Monarchs we were talking about, like Mask of Restrict, you better have MST or Heavy Storm, or it's just like you literally cannot play. But in this deck, you see Restrict. It's like, okay, I'm doing Junk Synchron, I'm going into Synchro, or I'm going Miracle Fusion. If they have Oppression out, you go Caius. And it's really hard to just stop with one thing.
Yep, this is the granddaddy of frog decks right now. It's just proving to be really resilient into the meta. It's a big 3 deck. It runs only good cards. This particular list is by 10-foot. You can see variations. He's got a lot of traps here, but it's pretty flexible in what you can do. We see some people run more extra monarchs. We see some people run more traps, but at the end of the day, it's running 3 Miracle Fusions, which is the most coveted extender in Frog decks, I think. It naturally fits with the deck's water engine, so it's just a really, really good design. Roghnach, I know you were one of the people that helped create this deck way back in the day.
Yeah, that's right. Like there were different versions kind of floating around. Like it wasn't something that was taken very seriously at the time. So then eventually, yeah, I was able to bring it to a top at Ribbit 2 and a little bit before that, but that was mostly with polymerization and stuff like that. But I was thinking like at the very first slide, there was a lot of different points that we were talking about for how to evaluate what makes a good frog deck. And yeah, like there's a reason this deck is very successful and people like it possibly the most of all frog decks. Yeah, like it kind of fulfills a lot of those things that we're talking about, like pressure on the open board, resilience to the side deck, all that kind of stuff. Like, you know, all the reasons are there. I suppose the only one where it slightly falls down a little bit is it can be in terms of hand quality. That sometimes you just randomly get hands that are like Alias plus Ocean plus Squat Frog plus Treeborn or something. Like just you're not really able to do much with it, but it's the same for any deck. You can get like in Vayu, you could have like Vayu plus Shirako plus Vayu plus Return or something, and you can't really play that. So whatever.
Yeah. I think that's probably the main point. I think is a con is because you're running multiple engines. It's not going to be as linear as Frog Monarchs, like the traditional build where you're going to see your Monarchs. Like you play so many, you're going to be able to get a Frog out and Caius because that's all the deck is designed to do. But when you have all these different engines, like you said, you kind of have to draw all of the correct pieces from each one to be able to make plays.
Yeah, and I think the other big con of this deck is just I wouldn't say solved, but everybody know this is a known quantity. People are prepared for this deck when you're going into a big event. They know how to play against it. So I think that's probably one of the things it has going against it. Is just everybody knows this deck now. You go to a locals, multiple people are playing this deck. You go to a big tournament, you can expect maybe like 10 to 20% of people playing maybe a deck very close to the one we're looking at.
And that's something that I like about always innovating new things, is that I just like having that element of surprise. And like you said, this deck doesn't always have that, unless you have like a really special tech in it. Like actually, even in this list specifically, like 10-foot would have the Phoenix Wing there just because people would be seeing a set card and expecting a Mirror Force or a deck break. Then like someone like say a Stardust into it and then get blown away, that kind of thing. So not a whole lot of room for a huge innovation, but there can be like little text that you can add here and there.
Yeah, one of the more recent innovations with some hero frog decks, like I think Fraser Smith had it, was like the malicious with a future fusion, which is hotly debate. Do we like Few? Do we dislike Few?
Fraser
but-
plays Dandy. He does not
Dandy,
like.
yeah.
He doesn't like Mally. We
Oh,
know
he doesn't
that.
even run Dandy. You're right.
Famously.
Yeah, he doesn't even run Mally. He runs Dandy. Wow. Yeah. Either way, the point is like Future Fusion is one of those cards that like it turns off if played incorrectly, it turns off your entire engine. But it's so much of a huge plus that like it's sometimes worth like I there's pros and cons for that too. But there is some spice that people are testing in the more modern Edison world. But let's talk about where we think this fits in the grand scheme of it all. Okay.
Throw it in S. Throw it in S. Let's move on.
Yeah.
So S, yeah.
I think that's fair. We tried to list out some cons because I do think even the S tier decks, they have some things that you need to look out for. But as of right now, it's the best one.
So this is actually a deck that Declan himself, it's popular on our channel, our most popular video to date, Frogs, piloted by Declan. Declan is a firm believer that polymerization is saucy. Obviously in the deck dev meta, not so much, but still, this is a spicy deck. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, so I mean, this deck, it has no results to back it up, at least. But I think, it has glaring flaws in the way I've built it. It's not at all resilient to cards like Christia. You just lose if they drop it in the main deck. But I think what I want to really focus on is just like polymerization as maybe a card that can kind of innovate frogs, and cards like King of the Swamp, which facilitate this water engine, because I've really been enjoying playing Moray of Greed. So maybe not, obviously I built it in an extremely fragile way here, but the fact that this deck can just spam out absolute zeros faster than any other deck that exists, I think, is really good. That makes it has a lot of extenders, which is coveted in frogs. You basically play like 9 fusion spells, or some, 7 to 9 maybe, if you're just playing less copies of certain cards. I have the Fishborg in here, so it gives you synchro plays as well. But yeah, the cons, it's special summon reliant. It loses really hard to certain cards, and they make you can't play the game. But Roghnach, what is your take on this deck list? I'm very curious.
This is actually, there's a few people I think who have kind of really gone in this direction, and I think it's really cool because we've kind of arrived at a lot of the same conclusions. So this is definitely very similar to a list I would have played several years ago. And I remember, in fact, like I didn't have Caius in the list as well, just like this. And just like this list, I had Pot of Avarice. And what I remember is like I used to summon so many absolute zeros that I'd be like, I have to summon more. But how do I do that with Pot of Avarice? And it was to the point where like sometimes I would summon like 6 or 7 absolute zeros a game, and they would like randomly have, I remember what it was. It was because so many people were on quick draw at that time that they would be looping with the Drill Warrior and Dandies, and I would have so much problems getting through that with just absolute zeros. So I remember that's why I personally moved on from there. But polymerization, I really do love as a card, actually. And I've pretty much been one of the most outspoken people about it. That like whenever people are like, oh, what should I add to my Hero Frog deck to really innovate it, to really give it an edge over other Hero Frog decks? I'm like, well, how about a 4th Miracle Fusion? That sounds pretty cool, but people don't really go for it. But I think it's really cool, actually. I think it's a Miracle Fusion that fuels other Miracle Fusions in a way, if you want to call it that. And I'm actually a really big fan of it. It's just like a really aggro card. Again, like you're saying, post side and against like, let's say Dinah, Christia, as you're saying, those kinds of cards, not necessarily fantastic, as well as Kaiku. If they like banish your Mally and your Treeborn and stuff, you can have a little bit of a problem there. But I think it's cool. I actually do like the list, and I hope people take it and like innovate it and play around with all these little tools like Moray and King of the Swamp and all that stuff that you like.
Yeah, I think the inherent synergy with King of the Swamp and Salvage and all that stuff is like is stuff that like needs to be explored more. I think there's also a card. I know I know the Declan probably doesn't like it. It's the one that adds back a hero and a hero that you use for polymerization.
Fusion
And
recovery.
Yeah, fusion recovery. Like I think fusion recovery is like that's one of the most slept like that. Just the more
Cool.
extenders is. But anyway, there's a lot of stuff out there, you guys. Obviously, it's not super tested, but we wanted to showcase it. One because it's on our channel, but two because we want more people to actually take it to an event, see what happens, take a similar build or something, their own build, be creative.
I'll go first, and I'll bite the bullet. I don't think that this deck is very viable in the way it's built now. It's really, really explosive and can catch people off guard, but it, at the end of the day, is losing to a lot of the things that are hot right now, which is main deck DDV, Christia that is in any deck. It just kind of can't really hang with those cards, so I don't mind dropping this in like bottom of B or like high C.
I think let's have a thought experiment. Like if we had like 10 people each playing the deck and brought it to an event, I think it's actually a pretty good chance that one of them could talk with it. So there's that. Like it is Hero Frogs at its base. It doesn't have the Monarchs, but it is like it's extremely explosive. And one thing I forgot to mention, like we actually didn't really mention this, but Mali in itself fuels that polymerization. I know you mentioned it in the video, of course, but it should be pointed out that people don't necessarily take that into account of how it pays for a polymerization later down the line. So you can actually have like multiple polymerizations in the same turn and randomly summon like as many as 3 absolute zeros in one turn. So that's actually kind of an edge it could have. So if someone had a really good day, they could talk with it. So in that sense, I think it should be at least bottom of B.
I'm so happy. Roghnach's hyping me up. Let's put it in B. Let's put it in B.
Right? This is how I am.
I love it. Now, okay, we invited Roghnach. We have to start bringing some of his extremely sick spice that not only he invented, but has topped multiple events with Geartown Frogs. I think you should start with this one, Roghnach.
Yeah, this is it's a list. It's definitely one of my favorites. Definitely, yeah. And I think like, obviously I was very, very hot on it. And even this year I talked with it actually, come to think of it, yeah. And I even like at the start of the year, I remember I even brought Garden Frogs we'll put in a separate category, but I brought that to a 9-player thing on Format Library, and that got me my invite to the World Championships because I just came first with that out of the 9 people because it was an invitational thing. Very funny. Yeah, this thing has like a lot of pros and definitely has some cons, like with the kind of hands you can have. You can randomly have like a lone Geartown just sitting there in your hands doing nothing. So sometimes I cut that to 2 just for that reason. There's lots of different techs you can play, so it's very, very flexible, very open. Like Primaterial Dragon can be there, Mobius can be there, whatever. This is very much like, I would call this like a pure kind of a list. Yeah, in that way you could play action units instead. So it's got like a lot of it's got a high ceiling. It can randomly kill you out of nowhere with like enemy controller plus Gajiltron plus Caius plus whatever, even multiple Gajiltrons. So that's something that especially you want in the Frog Mirror, because like Light and Darkness Dragon is not going to work in the Frog Mirror, and that's kind of one of the elements that is like, if you're in an environment with lots of frogs in it, I tend to like, I don't know if I'm necessarily going to break through 10 frogs in a row with this list, because a lot of it does come down to Light and Darkness Dragon and how cool that is. And randomly stuff like summon Gajiltron and then Mausoleum out a Light and Darkness Dragon, swing for game, that kind of thing, or like put them on a clock and they can't get through the dragon. There's so much I could say about this deck, and I think you can see my enthusiasm for it. I do really like it, and it's something that I've done quite well with. I don't know if it's necessarily the #1 best, even though I have said that in the past. I will say that. I'll put that out there. I have said that it was. So for all the people who doubted me, you might have a point. It could be.
All right, I am a believer in this deck for sure. I've put a lot of hours into this one actually. After you topped like some like PS5 tournament or something in SoCal with this, right, Roghnach? And after you did that, I that's when I picked up the deck, and to me, it feels really, really good. Like this particular list we're looking at is not your most recent top. I know you played a much more aggro version with like more enemy controllers and like autonomous action unit. But at its core, like this deck is just really, really strong against some of the meta decks that frogs typically struggle with. Gladiator Beasts, Blackwings, having access to Lad and Geartown, these like giant monsters that are resilient to traps, is really good. It has powerful extenders. The Geartown engine just feels so good. There are some conflicts with frogs, but if you play it right and you are experienced with the deck, that sometimes doesn't really feel like it is a conflict. But some of your cards just don't feel as good into the mirror as cards that Hero Frogs are playing.
Yeah, so like you could customize that for the mirror. There's ways to do that, but at the same time, at its base, you are looking at a deck that is trying to kill in one turn, sometimes run into Fader, and as well as Light and Darkness Dragon doesn't go well into Frogs. One piece of advice, because I can't necessarily account for like what would happen if we brought 20 people to an event with us, because they wouldn't necessarily know how to play it. And I won't call out names, but there were some famous streamers who brought this to the YCS events and had playing during the live streams, and I was like, oh my goodness, that's not how you play the deck. But one of the things I could say is try and hold your field spells as long as possible. So if you're thinking about playing this deck, like just try and do that as much as possible, and then hold it all as much as you can for like one single push. That's kind of how you want to do it as much as you can, because otherwise, like, you know, as Declan said, you might have your Treeborns blocked, and you might need that in a couple of turns. You mightn't have thought about it, but you might draw a Caius or an Econ, that kind of thing. So yeah, but if you practice it, if you really know what you're doing, I think it's, in my opinion, I would call it an A tier deck, but that's up for other people to decide.
Yeah, I think if we're ranking this, to me personally, I think Geartown Dragon is the best extender, or feels like the best extender next to Ab Zero. And if we were to come up with like, we have a big three of Edison, I would consider Geartown Frogs to be like one of the big three of frogs. It's super, super fun to play. The boss monsters are insane. Lad is super, super good, plays really well into the meta. And like Roghnach said, when we're making this tier list, the way I envisioned it was that all of these lists are being played by someone that knows how to pilot the deck. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fair to rank it as like, oh, it's a C tier deck because people can't play it, right? So if we're talking just for what it's able to do, I would probably put it in S or like the top of A.
I think it belongs in S. That's my opinion. I'm high on this deck. It is, at the end of the day, a bit of a meta call sometimes. If you know, people are on GBs right now, people are on Blackwings right now. I think it's a really good deck, and I honestly agree. I think it's one of the best 3 frog decks that you can play right now.
So it sounds like we got an A, an S, and S. So we got the we got a little bit of an ass going on here. We got Geartown. I think below Hero Frogs in S tier. Yeah.
I would say just one more point is that at the moment, I think it would be difficult to call it any more than A, simply because I don't know if we can even necessarily fear it. Because I know George said that like we're accounting for like what would it be played in a vacuum if people really know what they're doing. But I guess I'll just have to like really put out guides for people to play it the best they can in future.
I've never seen someone fight against their favorite deck so hard.
Yeah, you get the final word on this one. It's not an even vote here.
I'm thinking.
Yeah, what is the average of SSA?
Average of SSA is either S minus. It'd be for sure the bottom of S tier. So anything else that goes in S tier would be the harbinger. That would probably be the average. But I'm also down to put it as a not a tiebreaker, I say, but like if you think it's A plus, I'm down to put it at the top of A, but nothing will go above it in A, in my opinion.
I think that'd be fair. I think it's stronger than Frog Monarchs as a deck.
I think so too.
Oh yeah,
Easily.
Frog Monarchs is the bottom of A. Frog Monarchs is bottom of A. Like this is going to be the bookends. Where the bookend will be the top of A is Geartown, bottom of A is Monarch. Everything will go in between. Now we are onto another variation of the field spell deck. This one, on the other hand, is Garden Frogs, another one of your creations, Roghnach, using the Black Garden to summon out Shiba Warrior Taro, as well as the Reaper on the Nightmare. One of the things I always hated that you did is this double treacherous trap hole. Like I get it, but I hate it. Like
my teammate calls that a double hole theory, and he took it from Duel Links actually. Funnily enough, because you have 20 cards in that, and you just want to draw them as soon as possible, so you play 2 of them, and that was the case here.
the pros and cons. I just read them. I just read the pros and cons.
Yeah.
Yeah, the pro, nobody knows how to play against this deck, but the con is nobody knows how to play this deck. That's why we have the expert here. I know that from seeing some of your replays with this one, Roghnach, there is a lot of potential to like board lock your opponent and then set up an OTK over time, because if they don't have tribute summons, they just can't use the tokens in any way. And Substitoad comboing with Black Garden can be really obnoxious to your opponent. So tell us a little bit about how this deck works, or maybe not this exact one, but any kind of deck that's running multiple Black Gardens.
I think there's got a lot of overlap with Mausoleum Frogs or Geartown Frogs that we just talked about. In that one, Garden was in the side, and I always used to side it in with the Engineer, side out a Gadgetron for the Engineer, and then have it there so you can protect the Engineer, or you can like use that to protect a Gadgetron, whatever. But then from there, I was like, well, you know what? I actually really like Garden, and I really like the idea that you can blow up your field spell to summon something else as an extender, and then turn your Treeborn back on. So from there, I was like, okay, where are all the 800 attack monsters I can do with that with? And from there came the Dog and the Reaper. So they all kind of work together, and they can synchro together. They can do a lot of stuff. I would say this is by far my most complicated list to play, because even I've just been sitting there going like, oh my god, like what do I do? Like, oh, I have so many synchro options. I have so many like field spell options. Like I can kill with this hand, but I just have to sit there for like 5 minutes going like, oh, how do I do it? Going through every single option. So I love playing it for that reason. At the same time, though, you do need to really study up on your rulings. My God. I don't know if you've ever played against a garden deck before. Have you ever played against a garden deck?
Yes, you.
Oh, for me, of course, yeah. But yeah, that card really fries people's brains, and especially even people playing it themselves. They're like, oh my god, wait a minute. I have to think about like, does that have that? Like sometimes there's random rulings like versus shrink or something. There's always these things that come up that like you actually have to Google it during a game. So there's a lot of stuff like that. You have to do your homework beforehand. Same for Light and Dark Dragon. So the way that they work together, sometimes you end up like tribute setting Light and Dark Dragon under Garden, so you can flip it up later, not affected by Garden. There's a lot of different stuff like that. As Declan mentioned, there's the option to block their field up with tokens. I don't know if I've done that in a tournament yet, but I've definitely done that a lot on ladder. And sometimes people either just quit on you, or they're like, like I have to sit here for like 30 turns if it's a deck like Hero Beat that can't get rid of the tokens with any tribute monsters. So that's always fun. But in saying that, like you have to be able to, you have to kind of know exactly what they can do about that, and that comes with a lot of practice of using the deck. So there's a lot of like trial and error with getting good at this deck, and sometimes it's hard to know if you're even doing it right. So this is exactly a kind of deck where I would just need to put a guide out, and that's something that like all the best innovators in Edison, like nominated for Fraser's list, have done with their decks, like Dream Frogs or Winged Rhinos that you do with Succeed, all that kind of stuff. Like proper video guides explaining all the cards, what they're for, and all that kind of stuff. This is something that I have not done yet with Garden Frogs. So where do I think it is? I think it's really good, but at the same time, is it like a mainstream ready deck? No, it's really complicated. I love it. I would totally bring it to an event again, but it's hard.
As kind of like finding a place for it, I would ask Roghnach, if you played both of these decks perfectly, right? And you just knew like every correct play, we're just talking about like the maximum potential. Would this be better or worse than standard Mausoleum Frogs?
I would say better. And I would say even like I get a lot of stuff wrong with this deck. And like I said, it takes me a long time to like figure out, because Shiba Warrior Taro is a tuner, which means that with Reaper, with Engineer, whatever, you can go into a synchro, like Ancient Fairy Dragon, and from there blow up a field and do something else, all that kind of stuff. So I'm not even, all the time I learn different rulings, I learn different scenarios kind of stuff, so I'm not even playing it properly. So that's kind of exciting for me, that I could come back to this deck and really improve it all the time. So I would say, yeah, better than Geartown, has a lot of potential.
Yeah, Roghnach, you're probably like me and you have like a list of every single 800 attack monster, every single 1600 attack monster that's
Yes.
legal in Edison, like just to know what you could do with it. So I think there's a lot of hidden potential with Garden Frogs. I think that's probably the best way to put it. Where like I think the Geartown Frogs are a little bit easier for most people to take to an event and do well with, whereas the Garden one is going to take like a true a true master to get value out of it, but I think somewhere in A tier, either next to or on top of Geartown is a solid spot. But where's everyone else
Yeah.
feeling? Declan?
I mean, you're blowing my mind right now. I was ready to just drop this in the question mark tier because nobody's played it basically except for you. I brought it to one locals with 0 testing, and it was the worst decision of my life. I had no idea what to do. But yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna follow Ronnick's lead. If you want to drop it in A tier, then I'm good with it. Cause yeah, otherwise I was just gonna drop it in question mark. I know it's a good deck if you play it well. That's all I know.
Yeah, and one thing also to mention is, well, two things actually before I leave it is, the garden really, really, really helps against frogs. That was one of the biggest reasons why I really loved it in the main deck. That's like Gadgetron plus garden is actually really hard to get rid of. Like they need specifically like enemy controller plus a bunch of things, and even then you ended up kind of like blowing up the garden later to summon back a dog or a reaper, and then going from there. So there's a lot of things I can do. And also I should mention that Dat Jinja, the user on the Frog server, very famous for posting all kinds of things in frogs, he made a fantastic guide for this with all the rulings and all of the like scenarios, a Q&A, like lots of really cool things that he did for people to learn this deck, which is really fantastic. So maybe I can put it in the description or something, and people can learn about how this deck works and all the little individual rulings and all that stuff, because a lot of the work has been done by him for people to learn this deck.
Huge.
So
Honestly,
thank you,
that is what we want. Like, in the end of the day, we are just frog lovers. We want people to try some cool stuff. We're jank lovers. We're frog lovers. We're new meta innovators. Garden frogs above Geartown or next to Geartown.
It sounded like it was going to be above it.
Yeah, a little bit. I think so.
A little bit. Ooh, hot, that's a hot.
Yeah.
That was.
This is amazing. I love
Declan's
how this
so
is shaping
happy
up already.
Yeah.
Declan is so happy about that. Like, he just wanted to know. He just, because he had it, like, we had this question mark tier, but I realized it was more because we just didn't know enough. In case like there was a particular list where like everyone here is like we just like maybe it's good. Like, anyway, we have a couple more lists to get through, so let's move on to the next one. You ready for the next one? We got some Yamata Frogs. This is also our final list of yours that we had. We couldn't ignore it because there were some very specific side deck cards and main deck choices that are just so unique to other Edison decks that we had to talk about. So please talk about this this Yamata Frog deck.
This is kind of like an offshoot of Mausoleum Frogs that I had like a Yamata version with Mausoleum, and it actually got featured on DB Grinder's channel once. It was called like Tribute Frogs, he labeled it as. I don't know why, but that's what it is.
That doesn't even make sense. All like what?
It's funny because Mausoleum is when you don't tribute, so I don't know why that. Anyway, it didn't matter. It was very similar to this. It just had Mausoleum instead of everything else. And I had a version of this that was like with plants, and this is kind of like a spin-off of plants that kind of evolved around the same time, the Plant Frog deck. And I came back to Yamata Frogs and I was like, okay, what if I just use the dandies that I had in Plant Frogs, but I put it back in the Yamata thing? Can it finally do something now? Because I was like, this deck is just really not ready for a tournament or whatever. And I suppose it kind of was the missing thing. And as well as the Fishborg, I was definitely not a big fan of Fishborg at all before last year. A very big hater of it. And I was proven very, very, very wrong, as we're about to find out later in this video. Extremely wrong. But anyway, it works exceptionally well in this list because you discard your hands to summon the Yamata Dragon. You can, like, even after you draw a bunch of cards with Yamata, you still have it back in the graveyard. You can still discard stuff, and it's perfect. It's the perfect card for it with Foolish Burial and 1-for-1. So that's a really cool thing. I love this list. It's fantastic against frogs because, it's kind of like Mausoleum Frogs without a lot of the explosiveness, but it's more control-based. And eventually, once you give them one little tap, one little kiss on the forehead with Yamata Dragon, and it's over. Suddenly, it's in a whole other universe. It's well taken.
I love that. I love that the way you put that, because I do think that is like, it truly is like Yamata or bust. But if it happens, it just, yeah, that's the drawing into all these Wing Blasts or Reiki Breaks. Like, that's just like all this back row, all this like actually relevant back row, relevant like Caius and Lad for later and stuff. Like, it's a cool deck. I do think it's lack of extenders though. And it's lack of like more than a turn play. Like, if the Yamata gets stopped, or if they have some way to like like a fader or something. Like I think that could be really like not detrimental, but you put a lot of effort into getting it out. So I think that's like
Yeah.
the biggest like sadness is like if it gets stopped, it's like, well, GG's y'all. That was a good run. Like,
Yeah, I think I might have to need to be a little bit of a hater and need to be convinced with this one because for
Mm.
me, you're building up towards this one big play of attacking with Yamata, and if it goes through, you probably win. Like you can go up to +5, you know, like it can be insane. But as we'll see with some of the decks that are later on in the tier list, when they do the thing that they're trying to do, they win the game on that turn. And this deck is not necessarily trying to OTK you, it's just trying to generate big advantage. It all hinges on one battle phase, and if it goes wrong, you can just be out of the game because you negged yourself a billion to try to get in with this and plus a billion. Um, I don't know if I think that this is a particularly great frog deck compared to some of the other things you can be doing, but it has a big surprise factor that if you resolve the Yamata, it's probably almost always GG.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I love this build. I remember seeing it for the first time and just being like, there's finally a card that to me fully justifies the like 6 discard traps. Just because if it does go through, you generate so much advantage. And like watching this deck perform was just really cool to see because it to me felt super balanced. I think the timing of it was really unfortunate because around the time when I saw this deck was when everyone was playing 3 Legacy, 3 Jar. It was like almost at the exact same time. And I remember looking at that and thinking like, I don't know if that's a problem for this deck. But I was curious to see what you think about that.
Yeah, the legacy in particular, people bring that up, and I'm kind of like, if that's all they got, they just want to draw 2 cards. I'm like, great, I'll draw 5. Okay, because the idea is like you're clearing their back row first. So if you're scoring points with Unifrog, you're getting the discard traps. You kind of really have to know exactly when to use it. It's very unforgiving, and like you're saying, like it's all in. And like Declan was saying as well, like everything hinges on that one Yamata Dragon. And if it goes wrong, you are screwed, especially versus Blackwings. So this is a deck that has. It's kind of like the opposite of Frogs. Like the Light and Darkness Dragon is great against Blackwings and horrible against or what am I saying? Against Frogs, and vice versa. Like the Yamata Dragon sucks against Blackwings really, really badly, really bad. But at the same time, yeah, like big shout out to Leo Baca, who I worked with to help him get the stuff to top. It's all his performance. I have not performed with this deck. He has. So well done to him. This is the list that he topped with. And yeah, I'm surprised it actually was able to do it this year. I never thought I would actually be able to make a Yamata Frog deck work, and I guess it did. So it's not like you're saying it's not like the best frog deck. It will need some other ingredient. It needs something like, I don't know, Trunate or something like that. Some missing thing. It's missing something. I don't know what it is, but
yeah.
it has potential.
So now let's talk about where it belongs. Then it is missing a lot, but I think it is definitely a still up and coming type frog list. You know, so where do you think we're gonna put this one on the tier list, everybody?
I'll be the hater. I think it's a really cool concept, but I just think, I think this is a good deck in the context of Edison. This can steal games, it can be really good, but in the context of what you can be doing with frogs, I don't see a lot of reasons to pick this over a lot of the other decks that we're going to be ranking here. I'll throw it out there that I think it belongs in C, but that's just my opinion.
I'm not far off. I'm thinking like mid B, maybe low B, something like that. One thing we forgot to mention also is Star Blast. It randomly like surprises them, and like we would be remiss not to mention it at least because that's the card that like people are like, oh, I've meticulously worked around the discard traps. I know exactly what my opponent's going to do. There's nothing he can do. No monarchs, no nothing like this he can do in this scenario. And you just use it and then like Yamata for game or something. How could I have predicted that? So that's one of the cool things that sets it apart. But yeah, like you're saying, it's got some work to do.
Top of C, bottom of B would be like, it sounds like the vibe if we're gonna meet in the middle. And I think we have a C tier. We got to use it. I think let's just put it top of C just to spread out this this tier list a little bit here.
I don't mind it
y-
being in C.
Yeah,
It's
I
fair
think
enough.
that's fair. When I'm looking at what is in B, which is basically just Ab-Zero Turbo, I think the main thing we're talking about for like the boss monsters, Yamata, it has to be able to deal damage and attack, and then something like Ab-Zero, they have to stop the summon or it's doing what it's supposed to do. So as a boss, I think it just makes it a little bit stronger. So maybe that would justify having it in C.
Next up, okay, we're finally off of Roghnach's. We're getting out of your mind for a second. We're gonna go to a little bit more builds that kind of like fell off. They were like earlier builds. Yeah,
Yeah.
this is still you. Don't get me wrong. This is still you.
Roghnach.
But this is
his
definitely
child.
this is more of like a for a Roghnach build, a little bit more of a standard like kind of build, like a more straightforward linear approach. This is Diva Frogs. It's frogs, you know, with the class instead of in replacing the hero package, or in my head, that's what it feels like, with like deep sea divas, so with tuners and stuff.
This is a really good deck. Diva is a great card. It's one of the best cards, single summons in normal in Edison format, I think, because it's just a 1-card 5. If you have Treeborn access, it can be 6 as well. It enables you to play cards like Salvage, which is a +1, and consistency cards like Moray of Greed. You know, it enables synchro plays with the Monarchs. You can make 8s as well. And a really, really cool thing about it is that this deck supports DDV, because you know, all the decks that you want to side DDV in against, the Frog Mirror, Dragon Turbo, Fairies, you also want Vanity's Fiend in. So you put in the 3 Vanity's Fiend, you put in the double Deck Devastation Virus, Diva makes Cataster. It's really surprisingly consistent at supporting Deck Devastation Virus. I think the main cons with this one are it loses to really hot and common side deck hate. So Diva conflicts with pulling the rug. So all your cards get hit by pulling the rug. Deck Devi, you can't really side out the Diva engine, or else it's no longer Diva Frogs, unless you're playing like a cool transition strategy. So all your stuff gets hit by Deck Devi. You can lose on the spot. I think that's really what's holding it back.
Yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of that, and especially with the points that are listed there that you're mentioning. Like, yeah, those are a lot of that's basically the essence of the deck. At the same time, there are ways to play around, for example, the hate for this deck. So you could side like a 3rd Salvage, which I haven't done in that list, but that was a very old list. It can be adjusted in very different ways. You can play like the Sea Hunter, you could play the Water Art Owie, you could play the, God, I don't even know. At this point, you play the Action Unit or something like. There's a lot of different ways to innovate this one, and I haven't really spent as much time on this playing it now. But it's a list that I obviously love, and it's just a really kind of basic solid list. Like, it's kind of in the same category for me as like pure Frog Monarchs or the Stun Frogs or those kinds of things. It's kind of in that same category. Like, as you're saying, like it does one thing a turn, but it just keeps the pressure going, and it just has like basic fundamentals. It is a deck that relies a lot on how well you know the Frog engine, because if you like mess it up and you don't get that extra frog to your hand or something, then later you're screwed when you draw a Moray, that's kind of thing. So you kind of have to play it very impeccably. One person that I should shout out is the Poke Rapper, who has done like a video series on this deck. So I've helped him to a certain extent. Most of the work is his for playing this deck. He brought it to War League and kind of that sort of thing. He brought it to a tournament. He actually got a deck. What's that called on Konami's website when they do like a report?
Oh yeah, like a little article, like just on the website.
Yeah,
That's cool.
yeah, the articles. And he he got the deck report, the very first one for the UTW when he played this deck, and he won a mat with it. So that was kind of cute. Yeah. That's one thing.
I'll add to Roghnach's point. To me, this feels like a more modernized version of Frog Monarchs, because it's essentially trying to do the same thing with the normal summons. I think a lot of people say cards like Diva and Junk Synchron, they feel like pseudo Monarchs, because they're just bringing out like this decently strong like synchro. But in this build, as opposed to regular Frog Monarchs, you get to support the water spell cards, which I think is what separates it. So I also think it's really strong. I have a lot of fun playing it until you see the side deck hate, and then it feels bad.
Yeah, I think it's just one of those decks that like you can tell was a little bit of an older idea because it's not even considering how susceptible it was to deck dev. But obviously, that's things that can be changed. And I think that's like I think that's why I'm glad like we're showing it to people, because I think there's some people that don't realize, wait, I could put Diva in Frogs. Like Diva's only with Hero. What? Like it's so. What are we feeling in general with the Diva Frogs on this tier list?
For me, it's higher than pure Frog Monarchs, so a slight bit
I
higher than
agree.
that.
If we're
Pretty
saying it's a
reasonable.
modernized Frog Monarchs, I would agree with that point.
Declan?
I'm good with that.
Yeah, I
Yep.
think that's a perfect spot to put it. I think it's
Yeah.
just going to be like when later we're going to talk about another very similar concept. Actually, I think it's the next one. This is one that, yeah, it's a very similar idea. Instead of Divas, it's running the Junk Synchron and going all in on the fact that Junk Synchron is a dark and, you know, using more of a dark engine like Dark Arm Dragon, even running Tragodia, which is funny. I think a lot of Frog decks don't run Trag anymore, which is fine. It's not the greatest card, but it makes more sense in this build, right?
I think it's super powerful being able to run these super strong limited cards like Dark Armed and Allure, which is insane in Frogs for the same reason why I think everyone was playing Upstart in Frogs at one point, because you thin out 10 Frogs from your deck and then you Upstart, you get to draw what's guaranteed to be a good card. Allure is 2 Upstarts, right? You get to like dig 2 cards deeper into your deck to like draw into something like Dark Armed. I think, in my opinion, Junk Synchron feels better to me than Diva in Frogs because it's able to just get free pluses by bringing back Swap. And I think that it still opens the same like synchro plays. So I personally am a really big fan of this deck. I love playing it.
I actually brought this deck to my first ever in-person RBET, just with a few changes, but essentially this list by Corinna. I agree with George. I think Junk Synchron is just a little bit better than Diva overall. It can't be summoned on turn 1, which I think is the only thing where Diva excels, where Junk Synchron doesn't. But it just has so much of a higher ceiling and more versatility. Again, I think some of the cons for this particular deck are just, it is like a 1 play per turn deck minus dad. If you have the dad, you're golden. But a lot of times it's a 1 play per turn deck, and it has a pretty high reliance on the Treeborn Frog to be able to do, you know, it's running a lot of Monarchs. Junk Synchron becomes better with access to Treeborn. So yep, some of the drawbacks, but I think it's a really, really good deck.
For me, this is kind of one of the decks that I always just avoided, and it's just not my style of deck, really. And I think like it. For the reason I say that is, I tend to like decks that have a secondary option if you just don't open any frogs at all. And I find that when I was playing against this deck, like I was like, oh, thank God, like they only opened the Dupe Frog or something, because then they're really slow and they can't really do a whole lot. Now sometimes they do actually just randomly get back into the game and like somehow score a Dark Arm Dragon. I remember Dimitri used to say like one of the best ways to do that was like, and you probably have done this as well, summoning Roghnach and discard a bunch of darks. And then from there you can summon it. That's probably the best way to do it. I remember with my experience with Dark Arms, like I even had like literally a Vayu Frog list. I had like a Norliris Frog list. I've gone through a lot of different dark decks that have tried to hybridize with frogs. And in every case, I was like, oh, I wish I could play Dark Arm Dragon, but it's just like not quite there. It's just not really working out. So I was really surprised that people were playing that and keeping it in and like not actually cutting it after a while. So it seems to like still be in that list. At the same time, have people really stuck on this list? I guess not necessarily, but I don't know if that's really necessarily, I don't know if that's about the deck's qualities in itself, or if people just like all the new shiny toys that come out, because there's always like a new frog deck every week, and that maybe this kind of gets buried in all the different frog decks that are out. So what do you guys think?
I mean, I think it just has a very similar problem that like even Diva Frogs has, where like pulling the rug, not a super duper duper common side deck card, still a common side deck card, but not like the most. But it gets hurt by that. Deck Devastation Virus. This is also gets hit pretty hard by Deck Devi as well. Something that can't be understated. But yeah, I think the biggest issue with this deck, and the reason why it's probably not seeing as much love, is because on top of the meta shifting that direction, I think that like the other extenders that exist in the other versions of decks, which is the same reason why Diva Frogs is not used, like Miracle Fusion being a much better choice, Fishborg Frog being a better tuner. Like if we're talking about synchro, cards, like we clearly have there's a definitive better synchro deck to go towards anyway. So I think that's probably the main reason why Junk Frogs is not seeing that love. But I think if people are just obsessed or have like an ulti dark armed in their back, like they want to get into frogs and they want to use their dad, they want to use their ulti allures, they want like they want to finally rock Cold Wave. Mind you, that's one of the cards that I think is cool about this deck is that you can run Cold Wave pretty easily. You're not reliant on miracles, you're not reliant on salvages or morays. Like that's another thing that you can consider being really strong. But yeah, that's probably why Junk Frogs is not seen as much. It's just a slightly better synchro option out there, you know. But where are you going to put it?
I think that this deck is better than Pure Frog Monarchs because Junk Synchron is broken, but I don't know. Roghnach, I mean, coming into this, I thought it was better than Diva Frogs. I kind of have a lower opinion of Diva, but you are convincing me with it is very reliant on frogs, the Junk Frog deck. So, but I think at the very least, I think it's better than Frog Monarchs.
For me, I think it's very similar, but I have to say I would fear the Frog Monarchs, the pure Frog Monarchs more. And I think even this year, like with the Water Art Owie and stuff like that, like that's stuff that was added to the deck. And I think that does a lot more than the potential of whatever the junk stuff does or whatever the Dark Arm Dragon plays are, that kind of thing. I think that technically adds more. So I would rank it lower than Frog Monarchs. I don't know if it's like, I guess probably for me, high B. I think like, again, the litmus test of like, if we gave it to 10 people, would it top an event? It probably would actually. Like it's still really good, even if it loses to a lot of like the frog hate that it's gotten like more popular, but I don't know. It's not like that much different.
That's crazy. I love this deck. I love this deck. I do agree with those points though, and that's why we have you on to give that insight. So if we want to put it, lowest I'll go is top of B.
That's definitely the lowest I'm willing to go. I think the deck's really good.
Like, it's not much different, right? It's basically Frog Monarchs with some extra tricks. So,
Yeah. I think that's a good way to put it because I think that's where Diva does like kind of outclass it slightly, and I think that's a good point. Like the fact that you can do stuff without the frogs, that's something none of us even considered. Like it's like a very important thing. Like having just an android sometimes can win you games. Like just having a 2400 beater like that on turn one.
And the moray.
Oh yeah, and the
The
moray.
moray is another way to get into the frogs for me. That's why I like having that option.
Yeah, I'm willing to put it at the top of B. I think Moray, we'll get to Moray later. Don't I love that card right now. I think just adding that level of consistency to your frog decks, you'll brick on it late game sometimes, but it's a really good card and we'll get more to it later.
Okay, now we're moving on to full pivot, totally different deck, but we can't deny it fully utilizes the frog engine. This is Fish OTK. Fish OTK with the entire goal of getting Coelacanth out, spamming the field with a bunch of fishes to make Colossal Armoring Arm OTK, or just spam the field with enough monsters to win. Let's talk about Fish OTK.
Coelacanth is crazy. It's returned from the different dimension from your deck. It's not a fair card when it's getting resolved. This list recently topped YCS by Hammam Jamal. This is a very new take on the deck, which is basically just stall till I see the big fish, because this deck is very, very reliant on that strategy. Previous iterations of the deck by like James Ark played, Caius and just normal good frog cards in your deck. This list says, screw that. I'm only winning the game if I see the big fish. It is a one-turn skill strategy. You have the advantage of it being a surprise factor because sometimes your opening turns are like summon swap, send Treeborn. Nobody knows that you're playing the big fish deck. They summon a monster in attack mode. You happen to have the sweeper. You sweeper them, they're dead. Like, it can just be that easy. I think it just needs a lot of combo pieces to work, and it plays a lot of bricks, which is why you play the Moray, which is why I love that card. But what do you think about this latest version of Fish OTK, Roghnach?
I think it works. I think at the same time, like, I think we all saw that Learn How to Cook video, and it was unfortunate. It was a shame because I even thought, like, I was watching it and I was like, oh, this is so close. Like, he actually has the right, like, if he just uses the engine in a certain way, if he really emphasizes Unifrog and really goes for it turn after turn, or like, because that's kind of like the big advantage of these battle stops is that like they really work with the Unifrog. And that means that you don't necessarily need a sweeper. You can kind of just keep the Unifrog going there. Sometimes they won't even set a card because they're like, oh, I don't want to get hit by Unifrog. And then that's when you launch the fish. that's kind of the cool thing. And obviously, I really love Teva. Like I've been saying, Teva is a really cool underrated card for a long time. And some people were like, "Oh, thanks for recommending this card for me years ago. Now I randomly have this card that's like what $10 or $15 now. It's probably not that much now, but it's still pretty cool." So I think like it's a deck that it's really, what can I say? Like you really need to know the frog engine inside out, and you need to know the fish engine inside out, which I don't. I am really, really, really bad at the fish engine. I've tried this in lots of different lists, like with Mausoleum fish and lots of stuff. And I'm like, oh my god, I am so terrible at using this card. So I'm not a super expert on the fish. Someone else here probably is.
Yep, your fishes can only synchro with other fishes or waters for people watching this deck, so just keep that in mind. If you're going to pick this deck up and play it, just that is a part of the deck. It makes it harder for you to like calculate what you need to make.
Yeah, I'm not like a huge fish expert. I do think, to your point earlier, that I think this deck needed to adapt with all the stall cards because as Edison gets more and more refined, the decks get faster and faster and faster. And a lot of times you can just, like maybe in older builds that weren't playing all these the stall cards, you could just die. So to me personally, I think I prefer playing builds that are a little bit more like strong early game, middle game, late game strategies. But obviously, it is really, really powerful and it is a one turn kill deck. So I think the surprise factor helps a lot to what we were saying earlier, where there's so many frog decks out there. Just because they see the frogs doesn't mean that they're like, oh, he's playing fish, you know? So it's really easy to just hide what you're playing until you go for that OTK. So that's all I really have to say on it.
So where are we gonna put this? Fish OTK.
I think we can group it like with James Arc and this style of list as well. They're both different kinds of fish, but they're definitely very similar and speak to the fundamentals of it. Like I think it has to be at least B, like in my view. Like it can definitely top. It has proven it can top. So I don't know. At least, yeah, probably like low A, right?
Yeah, I could see low A. My initial gut was top of B right now because it is a really solid deck, but I think if it got popular, like it wouldn't be as potent. I think what's made it, in the instances that it has topped IRL events, it's been like one person who's really strong with the deck coming out of nowhere and like catching people off guard. And I think I would have a hard time of envisioning like we're in a fish OTK meta where this deck is just like everyone's on it, and I think it has to kind of come out of nowhere. And unlike some of these other frog decks where you can just comfortably run it into the meta, and even if people, well, I don't know about Garden and Geartown, those are very much surprise factor too, but I want to say top of B. That's what I'm thinking.
No, I definitely think that it has a very linear strategy compared to like Garden and Geartown that makes it easier to, if you know how to play against it and you have somehow are prepared side deck wise with it, like you're actually chilling. Like it's not that bad. It's such a good deck though, so I do think like B is fair, like top of B. So we got Dimitri's Heritage Frog list. We were considering calling this deck a lot of things like Exodius Frogs, Combo Frogs, but Combo Frogs felt a little too generic when there's every frog deck, especially the more newer variants, are comboing like crazy. But this one utilizes some crazy poison draw frog, symbols of heritage, Exodius combo to just draw through your entire deck, get to exactly the pieces you need so that you can follow up with like triple Armory Arms or Stardust Dragon plays, right? It's insane.
We need to get some gameplay on screen right now so people can understand what the heck this deck is doing, because I know most people, myself included up until recently, have just never seen it before. So I'll leave it to you guys to kind of talk about the deck strategy.
This one was originated by Frog Slicer. Dimitri took this deck to the top, got third place at Edison Worlds. So, I mean, that guy's one of the GOATs. He tops everything. It feels like that he enters. But yeah, when Marco said this deck is trying to draw your entire deck, he was not exaggerating. If you start the combo, if they can't stop it, it's a deterministic draw loop, which means you literally draw your whole deck. And so you just assemble. It's almost like Dragon Turbo, where it's like, okay, I got the sweeper, I've got this card, I've got this card, and then you just pass your turn. You end on double Stardust, Dupe Block. You will kill them no matter what next turn, because you can like do insane things like summon 3 Armory Arms. This deck is obviously good, like we've seen it do well, but I think where it struggles and what holds it back is you will go into time if you run this deck. If your opponent doesn't just believe you and say, oh, okay, it's gonna be an OTK, I'll just scoop, and they make you do the combo, you will just be going into time, guaranteed. It takes forever, and it gets stopped by DD Crow. And it's very difficult to play. Probably the hardest frog deck to play on this entire list.
Yeah, I was going to mention that as well. Like, it's probably genuinely harder to play than even Garden Frogs. I would probably concede that. Like, the amount of work that they had to do, everyone who's played this deck is like, yeah, no, you need to put literally months into the deck, like hundreds of hours just solitaring this thing in your room, in a dark room, whatever.
Why is it dark?
I mean, another level of difficulty here is it doesn't even have Treeborn. So this is like very far into most Frog players. This is like a total different style of play. It's total FTK. It's like, well, not necessarily FTK, but like effectively FTK. I think it builds like a giant board, right? That's the end board. That's what it does. It does FTK?
It doesn't.
I forget.
It doesn't have the ability to FTK, but it does have the ability to do what Dragon Turbo does and just have the sweet, like they can have end your turn with Giant Trinade, Heavy Storm, and the ability to make like triple Armory Arm and just go for game. Like,
yeah,
it's like
I love that word use, the deterministic draw loop. That's vocab I didn't even know existed. So yeah, that definitely describes that.
I think like there's not really much to say about this. If you know, you know, truly. I think more people should know it because I do want to see this deck. As much as I don't want to see this deck exist, I do want to see more people play it and not worry about people being like, I don't get what's going on here. And then just like forcing them to do the whole loop. And then now we have to go to game 2 in time. That's just, guys, come on. Let's like have a beautiful world where Heritage Frogs are a little more relevant here.
No, let's not. Honestly, I'll be the first to say that let's just not do that. I think we can just drop this deck in question mark because you'll never even know how it will perform IRL because of the whole time thing.
Yes.
It's just doing such a weird thing that's like really toxic. And don't get me wrong, I'm here for doing toxic things, but your turn goes on for literal like tens of minutes if they make you do the whole combo, and it's just not something that we really want to promote.
We could have a GIF. I don't know who is it Alberto is the editor, but Albert. We could have the FBI, or what's it called, the MIB guy with the memory thing. Like, you will forget this.
It's like, yeah, forget that you saw this list.
That's what it feels like.
Now we got Plant Frogs. This is the frog list that opts to, instead of running extenders like the Hero Engine or even Junks or Tuners or anything, they're instead running Lone Fire Blossoms, Dandies, a Titanial, and of course, Light and Darkness Dragon, the signature Roghnach special.
Yeah, so this was definitely another spin-off of Mausoleum Frogs. Once I really got into Light and Darkness Dragon, like once I saw Mausoleum and Light and Darkness Dragon, I was like, okay, this card's pretty good. It actually works really well against the decks I didn't realize that it worked so well against, like even Vayu out. It used to be like, oh no, if they have the Vayu in the graveyard, it'll just drain it, so there's no point in even summoning it. Nope, I actually just really like it against that deck as well, because you kind of just play in a certain way, and you drain them first, and like you trade back and forth, and then that's when you drop it. Lots of things like that. And I really liked the card. But then I was like, okay, so if Mausoleum works with it, and later I was like, yeah, Starblast works with it as well. So then obviously, what else can get me 2 tributes? And Dandelion was one of the cool things. And eventually, like, the discard trap lineup grew and grew and grew. And I was like, there's no way 5 is going to work. Oh, it does. Okay. There's no way 6 is going to work. Okay, I'll try it though. And yeah, okay, 6 works pretty well. And then I was like, geez, I actually want more. So, okay, I cut the Swap Frog, and I was like, I'm seeing way too many frogs, and I added the Karmika as well. And to this day, people are like, "Oh, there's no way that could ever work." And like in the comment section, wherever there's a plant frog video, they're like, "Are you going to cut the discard traps? I think it's a really good idea." And I'm just like, "No, no, that's actually genuinely the ratio that worked the best for me." And I brought this to War League, and like I played that exact list the whole time, more or less, without any element of surprise, and I was really happy with it. So the one thing, I think the number one thing to know about this is its frog matchup is pretty bad, and that was most of my losses in War League. So I mean, technically, you could say like Titanial beats over a Monarch and does whatever, but like obviously, on the other hand, you could say it just gets run over by Absolute Zero. So Absolute Zero plus Treeborn. So I don't know about its frog matchup, but everything else, I'm really, really happy about how it matches up against literally everything else. And then against like Side Hate, like all of the discard traps are fantastic for that. So much cool synergy. There's so many like substitute combos with Dandelion and with Cyber Valley. And there's lots of little intricate things that the deck does that are really cool. And in general, I just find it to be really consistent, which is kind of funny because like it has fewer swap frogs than normal, and like you might brick on Titanium and stuff like that. But even then, it was just a deck that really performed for me last year. So I'm pretty happy with it. It's not like a perfect deck again because of that frog thing, but it's one of my favorite ones.
This to me. You talked about how like you thought Junk Frogs or Diva Frogs were like the evolution of Frog Monarch. This feels like the evolution of Frog Monarch. Truly, like instead of running, because you talk about like how a lot of these cards are not good into open boards in the original Frog Monarch list. These are all cards that are amazing into the open boards. Like having a Titanial or Lad just there is just such a boss monster to deal with. And usually the Titanial is coming out with multiple tokens and stuff too. So it's not just like sitting there negating one thing, it's negating everything.
And backed up with the spell traps, and you can revive it with the dragon as well, which is so cool.
Oh geez, I didn't even think about that that extra element to it.
That synergy is disgusting. One thing I did want to ask you, I'm not trying to get too specific, but I think a card that is very good in this deck that I've been testing when I've brought it to locals is Foolish Burial, because it just makes your opening hands disgusting. If you see the Foolish with other combo cards, with a Lone Fire, if you see it with Substitute, it's ridiculous. So for me, that's like one of the cards that I think is good. Also, I think you potentially Pot of Avarice with this deck, just similar to like, it fuels the grave fast with Dandy and the Frog Engine and Lone Fire, and all the discard traps, of course. So just a couple cards to like maybe consider if someone wants to try this deck out and maybe thinks 7 discard traps is a lot.
Or they're like, oh, Karma Cut's expensive now. Like Pot of Avarice is like is a common, is cheap. Like that would be the vibe. Cut the Karma Cut for a Foolish, cut a Wing Blast for a Pot of Avarice, and call it a day. You got a good deck in your hands.
One of my favorite things about this deck is that it makes use of Lad's second effect, which I think a lot of other decks don't really do. Like I know traditional Frog Monarchs would play Lad, and they would just rely on its first effect for the most part. But with this build, you have so many good targets to bring back. Not even just Titanial, but like any of the plants are all really, really good to bring back. So that was my favorite part, is like people think the negation is annoying. And I've had people like Solemn Lad, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna bring back Titanial now, and it's just so strong in that sense. It's like one of my favorite Lad builds.
And I keep thinking, like, I hate drawing Titanial. I'm not really loving Lone Fire so much, and people have this experience as well. But then it's little things like that that really add up. That like, oh, that's why the plants are so good here. That's what, like, oh, I didn't open any frogs. I'm just going to summon Dandy instead. This kind of thing. Or like, I opened 1/1 plus Lone Fire. That really works. So sometimes I'm like, I really wish I had a better thing than the plants to put here, but they just kind of work with the rest of it. So
yeah,
here to stay, I guess. But
let's put it on a tier list, y'all. Where are these plant boys going? I do think it's better than Monarchs, like standard Monarchs for sure.
I think it's better than Diva potentially.
Yeah, I would say so as well.
Do you think now here, Roghnach? These are your two babies, the clash of your children. Is it better than Geartown and Garden though?
That's a good question. I would say it's probably better than Geartown. Yeah, slightly at the very least. Is it better than Garden? I actually don't know the answer. I don't actually know if it's better than Garden.
Well, I have one thing to say about Plant. So like I think my biggest issue with the deck is it forgoes like extenders in favor of just more traps. So that's like the one kind of thing where I'm like, is it better than Geartown? especially in this meta where a lot of people are on their trap stuns now. Those can be kind of devastating. I think when you built this deck, I don't think people were on trap stun like they're on it now. Like
No.
GB players are on trap stun. Everyone's siding like what feels like at least one copy nowadays. So that would be. I still think Geartown's better.
I'm down to put it between Diva and Geartown then.
Yeah, that's pretty fair. I was going to say as well, though, Declan, I like the point you made about how techable it is, because that is what people have been doing in Italy in particular. This deck has really taken off in Italy, and that's mostly because Leo Bacca famously brought it to the GCI #2 event, and he won first place in like 100 players with Plant Frogs. So because of that, he is the Plant Frog King of Italy, and people have been following him and taking a lot of Declan's advice, in fact, and putting in stuff like Foolish Burial and what else was there? There's Foolish Burial. What was the other card you suggested? I'm pretty sure they have used
A lot of
Avarice.
Avarice.
Avarice, yeah. Avarice was one. They cut the discard traps a little bit. So there's a lot of different variations people have done with it. So there you go. That's a deck that's actually taken off. So I'm pretty happy with that.
Moving on to the next list, everybody, we got ourselves Machina Frogs. And this particular deck, like, I personally like really enjoy. I don't think anyone here has had a ton of experience playing with it, but I just think Sphere of Chaos is like one of the most slept on
that
cards in
card.
the entire format. I think it's just so sick.
Yeah, I think
Pretty cool.
when you get to run like basically 5 copies of Stratos with all the gear frames and the Sphere of Chaos, like this build, to me, you get so many good pluses. And the extenders are awesome. Fortress is like a great boss monster that I think competes with some of the other big ones. Obviously, you have a lot of traps, discard traps to protect yourself. You're playing Dandy still. So it's just got like a lot of pieces going for it. And I personally really like playing it. I think the machines are all really strong.
Yeah, I remember like when I built this list, it was like the idea was based on a formula that like when I had Hero Frogs, I was like, okay, I want a level 4 that searches, I want an extender, and I think it was just like I want to be able to attack open boards really well, something like that. There's like a bunch of little categories. I was like, what does this really well? And I was like, okay, well, Machina does, so let's see if I can use Machina, and that kind of worked. And then like it obviously has lots of little synergies, like bouncing the gear frame and using the discard traps, like discarding a fortress so you can search a forest later, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of cool things it does, but I think like the main advantage this has over any other kind of frog list is that it's just really stabby, is how I call it. It's just like it really does a great job of like, or at least at the time it did when I made it, because I haven't really played it much since, but it was like really good at just doing like say 43 to the face and then later stealing them with a enemy controller and then going for game or something like that. Or like I also had Cyber Dragon in an early list. That was really good at going fast, and like you could special summon it if they bottomless it, tribute it for enemy controller, and then go from there, this kind of thing. And yeah, like the pluses, like with Sphere of Chaos, because you can go like Sphere, Search Trooper, discard for Fortress. That's a really common play because, you know, Fortress can be expensive sometimes. You need a little pluses here and there to actually fuel it a little bit. Otherwise, it kind of gets stuck in your hand. But I also, yeah, I wanted like a searchable tribute monster is something that I really wanted, because I wanted like, I have the soul exchanges there. I can tell this is my list because Dimitri deserves a lot of credit as well for helping Ryan Knight out with his list. And Dimitri very famously is one of the biggest soul exchange haters in the world. I am not. I like the card, but there you go. There's a lot of different opinions about that card. But in any case, having a searchable tribute monster for soul exchange is a very cool aspect of the deck as well.
Oh, definitely, definitely.
For me, this deck, what is really on the table for conversation is a lot of the side deck cards that come in against it. It's resilient to deck dev-y, which is really good in the current meta where people are main decking it. The whole Machina engine doesn't get hit by it. Your Sphere of Chaoses don't get hit by it, so that's a plus. But for me, what is a big drawback is a lot of just people already are coming to their locals or events with a lot of frog pre in their side, and then on top of that, you have them bringing their Cyber Dragons, which just absolutely can destroy the deck if the right situation arises. I know they're playing cards like the Bottomless in there outside to kind of hedge against that. So there are ways to play around that, but I think pulling the rug it becomes really, really good against this deck. It hits all your gear frames, all your monarchs, the sphere of chaoses, swap frogs. So to me, that's the biggest thing that's holding it back, because otherwise it's just playing only good cards. The Machina engine is really, really good.
Yeah, I think the funny part in the con that was mentioned is that it's less inherent synergy with frogs, which to an extent you're right. Like the machines don't have any real like direct obvious synergy, but I think Roghnach did a really good point to say that it's a searchable tribute summon, which is what Stratos does. And Stratos like would add like, you know, the evil hero Malicious Edge. That card's not that great, but it's still used because it's a searchable tribute summon. And the other side of things, we have Machina Fortress, a significantly better searchable tribute summon. So I don't think it has less synergy than we think it does. It just doesn't have any like wombo combo type synergy that can like, it doesn't combo as heavily with like subs to Toad, or like it doesn't use the water engine that well or anything, right?
Yeah, like the main thing it does is just damage above all. It's kind of like Burn Frogs in that way. I kind of call this the progenitor of Burn Frogs because it really led to that same philosophy that created that same deck. And Declan made a great point as well, is that Cyber Dragon, whether it's in the format or not, has a huge impact on how well this deck does. So it's kind of like it really can be a bit beyond your control how well it does on a given day. And the other thing as well is that when I was building this deck, it was before, I believe there was a point at which Dimensional Prison became the best, or not the best, the most common card in the format. So that was also something that really led to fairies becoming less popular as well. And obviously its effects, how well Machina Fortress can stab the opponent. So that's unfortunate as well, which is why Rheinide is always talking about like he's working on like Trap Stun in the side deck, or Nobleman of Extermination, or Dust Tornadoes, whatever way that you can get the Fortress to really do damage, because that's what you really have to do for the deck to do well.
So where are we putting Machina Frogs in this tier list?
It's giving B.
Yeah, I think so too. Possibly a little bit below Fish, I think.
I'm good with that.
Yeah, that seems like
Yeah.
exactly where I thought it would go. Next one, Hand Rip Frogs. So this is another Declan creation. Declan is our scientist. We've mentioned it earlier.
Mm.
Declan actually brought this to RBT and did so well. Like he got, what was your record, dude?
Brother, I was undefeated through 5 rounds, and then I misplayed. There was a way for me to win in time against the guy that actually ended up going undefeated on day 1. I misplayed. But yeah, this deck is a derivative of the Diva Frog deck that Roghnach made. It basically was inspired by that, and there is a story where my friend Albert in Team Starlight is a big X-Saber player, and when he would play that deck, I was just like, oh, hand ripping is just like the most toxic thing you can do in Yu-Gi-Oh! Like just taking your opponent's hand away from them is ridiculous. And then I just thought, okay, what if we could just make the most disgusting hand rip frog deck with the frog engine, water art, and that's where the DD designators come in. So this is kind of like people sometimes call it perfect knowledge frogs at our locals when I brought it, or hand rip frogs. This deck is a mirror match killer. I've never lost a frog mirror with this deck. Maybe just because I've been getting lucky, but also it just feels really, really, really good. You have open board pressure with Diva. If they bounce a swap to their hand and you have multiple copies of Designator, you can see their hand by hitting the swap. Then playing the other Designator, taking their best card. It has a level of sack factor that a lot of frog decks just don't have. Like if I go first and open Swap Frog, Water Art, Dust Shoot, like they can't even play the game a lot of the times. I think the biggest con with this deck is it loses to high pressure because there's not a lot of defense. So Black Wings, Gladiator Beasts, which weren't that popular around the time I built the deck, it was really around the time that Eric Shen, I think, had just gone back to back with multiple tops. So Vayu was a big deck. And frogs were big. That's why I kind of brought it and did well. But yeah, in the current meta against GBs, it's definitely not my top pick.
I was thinking about a list like this actually because I was playing Water Art Owie in Diva Frogs a while back, or like even this week as well actually. And I was thinking, yeah, like what if, I could play a deck like this actually. And I would say this is definitely way better than the other, like a lot of people, when they start with frogs, they're like, oh, Thestalos discards a card, and Dust Shoot, and Mind Crush, and whatever. And they're like, they add a bunch of stuff, and it's just into the pure Frog Monarch mold. And it doesn't really work because, as you said, like it just folds to pressure most of the time. But this is a bit different because actually, like, it can play independently without frogs. Like, you don't need to open frogs for the water art. You can have the Diva stuff for that. Designator is kind of cool, and it's something I haven't played around with enough to know exactly how well it does. I know that Thomas Darn in Fairies used to play this card a lot. He was big on it, and like I used to argue with him, like, oh, it doesn't show your hand, and I was always wrong. So I always underestimated this card. So it's interesting, and I would actually like to play around with this concept because I haven't really done that.
Huge. We finally found a card that he hasn't played around with. Let's go.
There you go.
We did it, boys.
And I have something to say about this from being on the opposite side, because I'm a Hero Frog one trick, and obviously Declan and we go to the same locals, so we'll get paired up a lot. And I can attest to the mirror match being one of the most toxic things that I could possibly play against. Like when I think the main difference, because like Roghnach said, we've seen builds with Thestalos, and it's not really important that you're just discarding a random card. And I think that was one of the flaws, is there's a lot of decks that play cards that want to be discarded now. So if you're playing against Vayu Turbo and you discard their Plague from their hand off like a random Thestalos rip, it feels really bad. But in this, it gets rid of the card. And that's, I think, the main issue with and you get to choose. So when I was playing against Declan, Dust Shoot in itself is really bad because it'll shuffle like your Caius back in. It's completely different when Declan looks at my hand and is like, I'm getting rid of this Miracle Fusion forever. And suddenly now my hand had like everything set up. It had all the frogs, all the heroes. I had my Miracle Fusion, and he's saying, that Miracle Fusion's gone, and you don't have Gores, so I'm just going to start attacking you now. And it was really, really hard to play against when every turn he's playing another card to look at your hand. So that's all I'll say about that. I think it's really, really strong.
At the end of the day, I think this deck is a meta call. It folds to high pressure decks like Hero Beat, Blackwing's Gladiator Beasts, but against the other decks like Vayu, I had a really, really in-depth side deck plan for Vayu because it was the hottest deck at the time. As you could see, the Armed Sea Hunters making an appearance in the side to hedge against Deck Devi, and just really good card. That's a water. It enables the Roghnach special, which is Vanity's Fiend plus Deck Devi, and it synergizes with your deck because then you get to see their hand and keep going. So it's a really, really cool concept that I wish I could have taken to the top at that RBET, but just wanted to feature it here because I think it is a solid deck, but it can't hold up against the entire Edison meta. Yeah.
Where do you think Hand Rip Frogs goes on this tier list?
One last point is that thinking out loud, because I can obviously see that like Flip Flop Frog has a lot of synergy with those hand rip cards, like with DD Designator, which I'm sure Declan knows all about. But at the same time, that's got me thinking like cards like not just Compulse, because he was mentioning also the lack of defense, but maybe like Phoenix Wing might have like some kind of a role here. If they like don't summon the monster that you put it back or something like that. I don't know. I'd have to really think about all the cards that like work like that, like Trunade, if you have a read on their back row, and then you might just like call Bottomless Trap Hole if you thought they had it or something like that. I don't know. I have to really play around with all the potential implications of this list.
I'm here for it. We can cook Roghnach after this. It's just I found the biggest difficulty for me is finding space because you run the Frog engine, the Diva engine, and then you run 8 hand rip cards. You know, the triple designator. I didn't want to compromise that. I wanted to go all in on the 8 hand rip cards. So yeah. But we can cook. Someone can refine this, but I hope it doesn't become the most popular Edison Frog deck, or the games will be miserable.
Hand Rip Frogs, though, what are we thinking? We have the question mark here for a reason, but we can also judge it based on its other merits.
I'll go and say I think it's better than Yamata Frogs. That's my take, but obviously it has no results to back it up, so I don't think we can in good conscience put it against a lot of the other deck above any of the other decks we have in like the B and A tier, so I'm fine with slotting it in C tier.
probably reasonable. That's where all the other hand drip variants would probably go. So until I know more specifically, because I haven't tried it yet, then let's tentatively put it there.
But put it above Yamata Frogs.
Ooh.
Sure.
He's like I personally think it does what Yamata Frogs does, but they're so different. But I love
They're different.
DD
Well,
Designator is just such an underutilized card in this format too. It's just like kind of nuts.
The sack factor is there. If I go first and I open multiple copies of this stuff, like you lose the game almost certainly.
It is disgusting. Okay, we have our last couple ones. The next jank on the list, Burn Frogs. This deck I feel like came and went. It made the price of Turbo Cannon go up like crazy, and then Turbo Rocket was like people were trying to like break Turbo Rocket in every single deck, and then they realized it's not as good as they thought it was. But I still think there's some underutilized sick sauce in this deck. So Burn Frogs, let's talk about it.
Yeah, like as I was saying, it kind of came from Machina Frogs, the idea that like you could just vomit your hand at your opponent for damage. And I was like, okay, Caius does technically like 34 a lot of the time. Swap Frog does 1,000 a lot of the time. That's all stuff that any burn deck would be really envious of. So can we just use a bunch of burn cards as the rest of the secondary engine and do the rest of the damage that way? And in that tournament, it turned out we could. And I think this deck kind of lives and dies on the battle stops. So how well you use the roars and wabokus. I think a lot of the time people are like really too afraid of like whatever threats coming their way and just setting them like every single turn, which is not really what you can do. And like even in the fish deck, it's the same thing. Like you can't just set them every single turn. You have to actually hold them or like use one turn to like normal summon a swap, then bounce the tree warden, and then set it, because then like you're protecting the swap that you've put on the board, this kind of thing. You're not every single turn you're like at risk of a one turn kill is what I would really have to say about that. And that's also where Turbo Cannon comes in, because the more that you hold those things for the right moment, the more that you'll have them to protect the Turbo Cannon when you really need to. Because if you have a Turbo Cannon sitting there, you really want to protect it so it gets an extra thing. Like if they summon something to try and kill it, then you protect it and it can kill another guy the following turn. So that's a huge difference. And I think there's a lot of cool things in the list, obviously, like the creature swaps, working with the lava golems. So I'm sure Macro was thinking about all these little interactions that it has. I personally love the marshmallow. No one else seems to love that. I think like Reaper cards that like block attacks in Edison are really underrated. Like I even had that fairy deck that has like 10 of them or however many it has.
Yeah, I remember like Marshmallow might be your most favorite non-frog card, because he just does like I saw it in your other fairy deck too. I'm like, this guy loves this stupid this stupid card.
It's awesome. I love it. And of course here, like 1,000 damage, that's a lot. It really is a lot. Even Magical Cylinder, like people cut that immediately, and I was like, no, I won so many games in that tournament with that thing. It was so funny. But anyway, yeah, it's a deck that I would still say is a work in progress. I'm working on a lot of stuff with it, with like Injection Fairy Lily and Zoma the Spirit and creature swaps and lots of different things all at once, and finding the right mix of things. I'm sure I'm gonna find some innovation for it that's really cool down the line.
Yeah.
This one, I think this might be the deck that made me fall in love with frog cooking, because seeing you pilot this to a top on an online tournament, I remember watching the boss just being like, this guy's insane. I was like pretty new to the format at that time, I think. But you know, I'll be the bad guy, and I'll talk about some of the cons, because I mean I do think that this deck is a stroke of genius. Like the synergies are awesome and really cool with the stall cards. But for me, one of the things we mentioned earlier, open board pressure, you're kind of relying on your opponent to put stuff on the field for you to blow up or to Monarch or to sack off with Lava Golem. So it really relies on the surprise factor, which is a pro for the deck, but it relies on your opponent to kind of commit for you to like do what you want to do. And it doesn't have any extenders that I can see in the main deck. Lava Golem is a special summon, but you can't normal summon the turn you use it. So that is something that for me as a frog player is always really coveted. I don't like to be limited to one play per turn, and this is a one play per turn deck.
Yep.
And the card quality overall is just, like I said, pretty situational. Like Lava Golem, they need to have 2 monsters. Marshmallow, they can't be playing Black Wings. Like there's just certain cards that are really good when they're good and not so good some other times. So those are some of the cons of the deck.
Oh, dude. I do want to say I'm surprised more people don't play creature swap in frogs. This is the first frog deck to whip out the creature swap. It's like, do people forget that like Treeborn comes back every turn for free? Like this is just a potential brain control. I don't know. That's just gonna be my hot take as a non-frog player. I'm like, why is I'm a creature swap lover, so like.
One of the coolest things about Creature Swap as well is that it makes Dupe Frog a really good card, actually. Like randomly, suddenly, it's not just something you set, it's actually like something that you give to your opponent and it gives you a free thing and does lots of damage because 100 attack is nothing at all. So you're actually really happy to draw Dupe Frog all the time, to such an extent that sometimes in a list with Creature Swap, I actually have triple Dupe, which I normally almost never do just because I like drawing with Creature Swap. So beware of that if you're going to try that card. It's something to try out.
No, 100%. Okay, Burn Frogs, where are we going to put this bad boy?
George, you've heard a lot of arguments. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a super fun deck. I think the biggest pro in my eyes, just from an outside perspective, is like a lot of decks aren't really equipped to deal with burn damage. And sometimes you can just be in a situation where you keep putting this damage out and they're like, I don't know what to do. You know, so I think the surprise factor is really strong. But I don't have a whole lot of experience playing it. I've seen Declan play it at a couple locals, so I think it is a really, really cool concept. But to Declan's point, the overall card quality might be a little bit weaker than decks that run like. We've seen boss monsters like Fortress, Gachiltron Dragon, Ab-Zero. And compared to those, it seems a little bit weaker. But as far as where I would put it, I don't know if this is something that can fall on me. I feel like I have the least to say about it.
Yeah, Roghnach, where would you put Burn Frogs in the? Now we're looking at everything here.
I would say possibly a bit bigger than Machina Frogs. One thing I have to mention about that list in particular is that it did nothing at all without drawing frogs. And that was definitely a fault that had to be corrected later in testing, like adding stuff like one fader, one scapegoat for the enemy controllers of the creature swaps or something like that. Especially for the turbo rocket, syncing with the little goat tokens. That was something that helped a little bit. Like Marshmallow gets the Monarchs, I guess, that helps for that. But there was one game in the top 4, and I think it lost me the whole tournament, where I drew for like 15 turns, no frogs, and I lost against that zombie deck. And the guy, very famous, he actually hosted a tournament today. Anyway, he never lets me live it down. That's one of his proudest achievements, is beating me, and he won the whole thing. He won that tournament because of that. So definitely has to have more independence from Treeborns. That's one of the faults of this list, and that's of course one of the things I have to work on. And like Declan says as well, like it can't really pressure open boards. So I like Injection Fairy Lily. I've been working on that. Same for Zone of the Spirit. That can really punch open boards. Yeah, I think like it's a deck with a lot of potential that I keep coming back to over and over because I just love it so much. And I just think, I do believe in the idea totally. I just don't think it's there yet. And this list is not quite perfected.
No, yeah.
So I would say B.
So I think you're saying B. I mean, Declan, where do you think? He's thinking above Machina, but where are you thinking, dude?
I think he's crazy. As I said earlier, I think
That's fair. You're right, actually, I am.
I mean, I will follow your lead, Roghnach, because I don't know this deck nearly as well as you did. I played it at a few locals. I did well. It's a good deck, but I think, again, if people start playing this one, people will come with the burn pre or like know how to, and it just can't. I just think in terms of individual card quality, cards like Absolute Zero in the case of Polyfrogs, Junk Synchron, Machina Engine, I don't know if I can put it above those ones, but I will let you have the final call. I would say like top of C, bottom of B, but that's my opinion.
Yeah, that's reasonable to have that opinion. Totally. I just slightly disagree. I would say
let's listen to Roghnach on this one. Let's put it above Machina.
Yeah, I something about like, because you know what? It sounds like he's almost like He's like, just trust me because I'm about to bring it to something. Like,
It's so close.
okay, now we're on to the final two, and these two are, in my opinion, the new hotness, the new approach to frogs that has been very successful. Starting first with James Ark's Dream Frogs. Dream Frogs utilizing a fishborg, utilizing a dandelion, utilizing the death frog just to as the main big extension pieces. But the biggest thing that we noticed, and the biggest thing that I think was like the true uh, glue for this, was that pot of avarice, triple pot of avarice. I mean, the frogs fill up the grave stupidly easy and makes those avarices super live, and you end up here with Dream Frogs.
This deck, they cooked with this one. It's a really good deck. I remember it kind of reinvigorated my love for Edison in a little. I was kind of getting a little bored of some of the decks I was playing, and when they showed up with this one, I was like, wow, this is an awesome deck. It's got extenders in the form of the Fishborg, and then it also is the traps are like pseudo. I feel like this deck is kind of characterized by having a lot of traps in my view. Because the avarice draws you into traps that then let you kind of just take control of the game and stay on top of the game. I think it when I first started playing it after they came up with it and people didn't know how to play against it, it just felt ridiculous. But now, as we've seen the meta developing and cards like DD Crow coming more favorable in the side deck, and decks like Gladiator Beasts, I think this deck struggles really hard in my experience against Glads, the Blackwings. I mean, as do many frog decks, but in particular, I think this is a high tier top frog deck, but I think among the high tier frog decks, it struggles more in those matchups.
Yeah, this is listed. I remember James Ark messaged me and was like, "I think Frogs is really good." And I was like, "Yeah, I do agree. I think it's really good," but I had no idea what he had in mind. And I'll be perfectly honest, this is totally not how I would have built a Frog deck at all. So it totally caught me by surprise how well this deck did, and it really did really, really, really well last year. And I think what was it? It took not only the biggest Edison event of all time, first place, and what else did it do? It was first place something else, right?
Yeah, I forget, but it definitely had
took
multiple
events.
premier tops.
Yeah, so there you go. I mean, I was always a big hater of not only Fishborg, but also Avarice. And I guess these things just work. So he's built his deck to like, in theory, that sounds like it's a recipe for like being really dependent on Substitute and really basically losing if you don't draw it. Because like, how else are you going to get Avarice live unless you just like discard for swap a bunch of times? But he has added like, I don't know, like Sangan, he has Dandelion and Fader and all that stuff for more independence from Treeborn. For whatever reason, it's really worked. And it's definitely, as you said, invigorated a lot of different players and gotten people really interested in the format, and also really revitalized that race as to like, what is the best frog deck? Is it Hero Frogs? Is it Dream Frogs? And now people are saying, is it Fishborg Frogs? Is it like something else? We will see. But this is definitely a deck that has done exceedingly well. So without any spoilers, I would imagine we're probably going to rate this very, very highly.
Yeah, George, go ahead.
I think it's a strong build. I mean, just looking at all the cards in this list in particular, what I really like is it has so many different plays you can do. So being able to go into synchro plays, and like now I think Death Frog in this meta is actually just a good card because it's able to run over stuff, which to me, I'm always a big fan of. That's why I like Hero Frogs, because sometimes you just need a Stratos to run over cards, you know? And I think Death Frog by itself is getting better. I think Sangan is a card that I'll always try it out, and I'll never end up keeping it in. But when you just think of the idea of what it's trying to do, where it can just get anything that you need, I think is really cool. But the deck seems really balanced. It has like a lot of plays. I don't think it loses to like one particular thing. I think it can play around a lot, except maybe like, I guess DD Crow does seem pretty tough. But I do like that you have the option of going to like synchro plays, or you have a bunch of tribute summons with Lad, Caius, even the Stalos, or Death Frog.
I loved Roughnach's point about this deck having a high reliance on Substitute and not necessarily a lot of good ways to get access to it. I mean, it plays the Sangan, but other than that, you kind of have to raw draw it or have 1-for-1, which is actually something that I think other Substitute decks that are trying to go in on the Substitute strategy, there are better ways to be doing it. I think this is a really, really good deck, but again, as the meta has developed, I think people know how to play against it, and some of the top decks in the meta, I would say, counter this deck. Blackwings and GBs in particular.
Where are we putting this? I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. We all think very highly of this deck. But where in S tier?
So originally, I'll be honest, I was actually thinking it would be the top of A tier, but as the list has developed and we have a slightly bigger A tier than I was even imagining, I think bottom of S, I would be okay with that.
Yeah, that seems pretty fair to me.
Yeah, I think Dream
I
Frogs
don't
is.
know, like,
oh,
what other deck could have beaten 470 players at whatever that event was.
I'll also add, as a last point for me, I do think the amount of times you're able to dupe block your opponent with these types of builds is like actually absurd. Because for me, a lot of times people hate dupe block, and once they deal with it, it's kind of like a sigh of relief. Like, okay, I'm playing Hero Frogs. I dealt with their one dupe block, and now I can move on. But when you like have your third dupe out and then they deal with that and then you avarice it back and you go for it again and you do a fourth dupe block or a soft lock or something, it gets really, really frustrating if your deck is not prepared to deal with that.
That reminds me of a fairy deck with like a million Reapers, because they deal with one just fine. Like they'll get rid of a Jelen Duo with like a Caius or something, and then I set another one. And it takes them
Yeah.
several turns to get rid of it. Same concept.
Yeah, because there's only so much spot removal in this format. So like I think that's why like Dream Frogs probably had a really good showing, is because it just destroys the like the dupe block stops so many decks in their tracks, and there's only so many main deck outs you have to it. So like it just other decks just run out of gas so much faster. Okay, so our final list. Frogs. So I had a whole debate with Declan because I didn't know what the difference was. I thought that any deck that was running Fishborgs and Frogs is just Frogs. So I thought Dream Frogs was Frogs, but Dream Frogs is a little different because this one is going all in on the Fishborg blaster strategy and Death Frogs and just synchroing. You notice there's no Caiuses, there's no like tribute monsters at all. It's just going in on the synchro strategy. So this is Frogs.
If I could just kick it off with one point about coming back to the Roghnach point about the deck has a reliance on Substitute. This deck has a strong reliance on Substitute, but it sees it way more often because it's going all in on. I did the math on this. It's something like almost like 2/3 of your opening hands are going to have Substitute because you have Salvage plus Swap plus another Water is one way, and then you also have the triple sub and 1-for-1, as well as just Moray of Greed to reset your hand and draw it. I think this deck is insane when it's doing its thing. It feels like it's the most broken deck in Edison. It's like Dragon Turbo levels of disgusting when it's going off. What are your thoughts, Roghnach? I haven't seen you play this one or talk about this one, so I'm dying to know what you think of this one.
Yeah, it's definitely extremely strong, and I think there's a pretty strong argument for it being the best one. I think, like, I don't know. This is just not my style of list. What I mean is, like, I don't really play combo stuff like Dragon Turbo, not Solitaire. I'm a control player, so I always have control in mind and like a really drawn out grind game and stuff like that. And this deck can grind, it can do that, but mostly it's focused on like assembling 8 or 9 different cards in your hand, so you just vomit them all at your opponent for one turn kill. That's kind of what it does. Which it does obviously very well, and it's like topped, I don't even know how many events, but a lot last year. And so Alistair and Adam Sheck, between them, I don't know how many tops they have, but I think proportionally for like the representation of that this deck has, I think they've pretty much shown that like it has like a disproportionate success rate for like whatever a frog deck is supposed to have. So I think it's pretty crazy. And yeah, obviously great point that like it has the best Substitute access of any deck in the game, because 1-for-1, salvage, Moray, all that stuff.
The advent of Reckless in this deck is really, really good because, like you said, you need big hand to do big things with Fishborg, and it doesn't matter if I don't draw for the next 2 turns if you're dead this turn. and I just draw, you get that +1 on the turn you play it, and then you can go off with Fishborg that much harder. Another thing that I've been messing around with this deck is finding ways to fit Future Fusion to just have even more access to Substitute, because Future Fusion plus Salvage is kind of the same thing as Swap Frog plus Salvage. So some maybe future innovations that can be had with this build. But George, what do you think?
Yeah, I actually think when you look at Forgs and Dream Frogs side by side, it's pretty significantly different to me. I think that there's always this balancing act with when you're making these decks, because when I look at Dream Frogs, it feels more like you have more options, and Forgs is the combos I think are a little bit stronger, and you're going to see them more consistently. So you're leaning in towards utilizing the Fishborg, but if you don't have your Fishborg set up, I mean, you're summoning Death Frog and attacking, so I think it feels really consistent. I mean, you're seeing a ton of 3 of cards, a bunch of like draw cards, Salvage, Reckless, Avarice. So it's kind of, to me, making it so you can do your plays, and as long as they don't get stopped, like Declan was saying, if your play doesn't get interrupted, there's not really much your opponent can do. You're going to keep generating so much advantage, which is why I really like this one, just because you're going to get to do what the deck intends to do most of the time.
So I'm not a frog expert like I always say, but I will say this. I think that Dream Frogs dips its toe into like this Fishborg type thing, and this just goes all in. And I respect any deck that goes more all in on any strategy, because I think that should be like, obviously you're gonna have some times where like, oh yeah, you'll lose to like a specific card. Like for example, if the opponent is playing fairies and they summon Christia, like yeah, it's gonna be very difficult to deal with. But like, you're not worried about those scenarios because 90% of the time it's not. You're gonna just do what the deck's supposed to do and just win. Making multiple armory arms as well, kind of like the Heritage Frogs. It's kind of like the evolution of like all these different frog combo things into just a more straight, like these are big bunguses and we can make as many synchros as we need and just win the game, because Fishborg is not once per turn and Substitute is not once per turn, and those two are just stupidly made cards.
The last thing I'll say about this one is I think what it's doing game 1 feels like it's the best deck in the game, but then what you do games 2 and 3 have to change because it has such a high Fishborg dependency. So you can see like Alistair's list at top, it's like it kind of transitions into something that's wholly different. I imagine he's not really going in on a full frog combo strategy after game 1. So that's something to consider. But yeah, I'm ready to rate this one.
Yeah, it's funny. I think it almost like what's it called when you like side like a different deck?
Smoke screen.
It like smoke screens into Dream Frogs, like in a good way, like where it has like the trap lineup for it, and I think that's really cool. So, earlier, Roghnach, you were saying there's an argument for it to be the best. Like that seems like could be hotly contentious. What do you think, Declan and George?
I do not think you're crazy. I think this could be the best frog deck in Edison format. It's harder to play than Hero Frogs. It's harder to play than a lot of the frog decks on this list, minus maybe Garden and Heritage. But I don't know if I'm there to say it's better than Hero Frogs yet. But I'm almost there. I think they're like 1A and 1B.
I think that's fair too. I'm also like, this deck feels really unfair to like what Marcus was saying. Fishborg and Substitute, just the way the cards were designed, they're both just insane to be playing this early on in Yu-Gi-Oh! And it just, when you get to do what you want to do, it's the best deck. I think the one downside is just the way it gets interrupted hurts a lot more than some of the other decks, but I wouldn't be opposed to putting it up there as well.
I will say though, its existence is the reason we're in a deck dev meta. So, like, thank you, Forgs, for causing main deck deck dev to exist. Okay, well, so we're saying top or in between. Let's get a finalized vote here.
Oh
My
man,
gut feeling is it's just gonna continue on its exponentially upward trajectory. And I have a feeling that it's just going to keep going. And I think eventually we'll say it is just a step above. That's my feeling. I don't know if it's true or not, but as from seeing the deck in action and everything I keep seeing about its performance, I just have a feeling.
Oof.
Dude, fuck it. I feel empowered. Roghnach, let's do it. Forks is the best frog deck in Edison format.
Forgs, baby, Forgs. And that is our Edison format frog tier list video. On the bottom of the tier list, we have probably tied Handrip and Yamata. Still in C tier, though. Still can easily top a tournament. Then we got Polyfrogs, Junk Frogs, Machina Frogs, Burn Frogs, and Fish OTK in B tier. And in A tier, everything here is super strong and definitely can easily top. You got classic Monarchs, Diva Frog, Plant Frogs, the Geartown Frogs, and Garden Frogs in A tier. And at the top of S, we have our kind of our own little holy trinity of frog decks. We have the Hero Frogs going all in on the hero strategy. Sorry, we have Dream Frogs, James Arcs, and we have Hero Frogs, and we of course have Forgs. And who knows if there are going to be more innovations coming in the future. Roghnach, thank you so much for joining us for this video. This is going to be a long one, I can already tell, but I hope that people that got to this point, thanks for watching. We're going to make more IRL content and more tier list type content like this in the future. So if you're interested in that, please subscribe. Consider subscribing.